Hey, what's up, dum-dums? Welcome to part 2 of our museum tour as we trek through the wonderful trilogy that is Night at the Museum, meaning it's time now to shed some light on the first sequel, the second installment, Battle of the Smithsonian. Released in 2009 and directed again by Shawn Levy, Battle of the Smithsonian was a movie that I personally didn't have that much of a strong connection to as a kid, or at least in comparison to the first film, that is. I still definitely enjoyed it, but I always found myself watching the original way more often. Heck, when it first came out, I barely had an inkling as to what the plot was, thinking it was about some new exhibits being added to the New York Museum or something like that. That being said, I still have nostalgia for it, partially from watching Let's Plays of the video game, and from buying the tie-in McDonald's toys. Rest in peace, Rexy and Easter Island Head. As time went along, it definitely grew on me more and more, but I always viewed it as inferior to the others. But now, after covering the first film, we can see if my opinions on it still hold up. Is the movie worse or better than I remember? Well, let's find out. Taking place several years after the events of movie number 1, Museum Night Guard Larry Daly's attempts of becoming a successful inventor have really taken off, with him even owning his own company, Daly Devices. Meanwhile, the museum has decided to replace its secretly alive wax exhibits with holograms, moving them into storage in the Smithsonian Archives in Washington, D.C. Soon after learning about this, and that his friends are now in trouble with Akhmun-Ra's vicious brother, Kamun-Ra, who plans to take over the world using the magic of the tablet, Larry sets off to get his friends back, and learns more about himself in the process. Now, with the first film being as well-rounded and complete as it was, and with this film not being based on any existing source material, it would have been so easy for the filmmakers to just phone this movie in and crack open a beer, but no. Battle of the Smithsonian is a surprisingly enjoyable and fresh experience, and for a variety of reasons. The first thing I want to bring up is how the sequel does a good job at exploring beyond the original film. We're now in a whole new, larger-than-life setting, one that's as big as they come, and one that I've actually been to myself. Well, really just a Washington Monument pretty briefly, but still. And the stakes have been raised substantially higher than where they were previously. We're introduced to a whole array of brand new characters for us to spend time with, alongside a slightly different tone, with a lot more sneaking and stealthing around uncharted territory. And the movie also adds to the lore, establishing new magical powers of the tablet, the most notable of which are the portal paintings, which are such a simple yet creative addition to this whole shebang. I failed to mention this in the previous video, but the whole rule in these movies is that if an exhibit is moving around outside the museum when the sun comes up, they turn into dust.
Dust.
And thankfully, this installment plays by those general rules pretty closely, which is such a relief, considering how many sequels tend to fumble that aspect. However, there was always something about this film that, as a kid, made it feel off in comparison to the first, and I wasn't exactly sure what it was. Could it be the change in location? Is it the different aspect ratio? Well, in actuality, it was how several of the classic characters got shafted in this. Many of them are left back home at the museum, or are just locked in this box for a majority of the runtime, and a good handful of them just didn't return for this at all. This was clearly done to make room for all the new characters this movie introduced, but it can be distracting. It's like going from the cast of Toy Story 2 to Toy Story 3, but with no given explanation. This can all be forgiven, of course, so long as the new cast is just as fun as the OG, and thankfully, they are. Kamun-Ra, for instance, makes a nice antagonist, and he has a very intimidating yet still hilarious presence. I love his goofy voice with his little lisp. I love how he feels betrayed by his own family, which makes sense considering that they never brought him up once in movie number 3, and I like that he's treated like an actual threat to our heroes. Plus, his henchman partners, Ivan the Terrible, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Al Capone, are a real treat. great, especially when they argue near the end. Though, real missed opportunity not having Kamun-Ra or Akmun-Ra interact once in this. I don't think they even do in Kamun-Ra Rises Again either. Would have been cool to see that sibling rivalry on screen. Anyways, plenty of the other comedic reliefs and oddities are pretty memorable, if a bit cheesy. But the best addition of them all is obviously Amy Adams as Amelia Earhart. She just has this spunky, let loose, I wanna have fun with you attitude in every scene she's in, and it's truly infectious at times.
Well, this is one humdinger of a hootman.
You could have thrown her into the first movie and she wouldn't have felt out of place there. She's truly the heart and soul of this puppy. She was what caused Larry to change, much like how Teddy was the first go around. And despite her never returning after this, just like all the other characters this movie introduced, she still left a strong impact, and it makes her final goodbye scene all the more gut-wrenching. I find myself getting watery-eyed every time she sets off in her plane. It's so beautiful. As for our beloved classic characters, I'm glad to say that our old friends were not mistreated here, if a bit pushed to the side. Every scene with Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, is still wonderful. Despite his reduced role, Robin Williams kills it as the former US president. Every time he appears on screen, you just get the feeling deep down that it's time to shut up and let the man give his words of wisdom. And Owen Wilson and Steve Coogan get a ton of fun moments here. I mean, come on, how could you not love the concept of Octavius riding a squirrel to free his beloved Jedediah from an hourglass? Like, oh my gosh. And that leaves us with the man of the hour, Larry. I've said before that Larry Daly is a very likable protagonist, and that statement still holds up as true here. I love how he manages to twist situations into his favor, or how he does everything he can to prevent his friends from being shipped out or killed off, regardless of how much he's moved on from them. Which actually leads me to the film's message, that being that the key to happiness in life is not success or having everything you want, but doing the things you love with the people you care about. It may sound corny or obvious, but coming from personal experience, I can assure you that it's absolutely true. And it's reflected quite nice here with Lucky Larry. Sometimes in life, we get so caught up with our own personal ideas and plans and agendas that we end up neglecting what truly matters, the people around us. And occasionally that happens at the worst of times when they need us the most. It also especially hurts when we ourselves discover that we need them too. And by the end of the film's fun climax, you just know that the Larry we love is back, once he says,
"What are you?" "I'm the night guard."
Random side note, but I also like the progression we're given between the first film and this one, as in, it first started with Larry discovering the magic himself, then followed up by him sharing it with his own son, and now with him showing it to the whole world. And while the father-son dynamic is barely even at play here, I do find that pretty heartwarming. Of course, as a comedy, Battle of the Smithsonian usually hits a home run. Several of the improv interactions between the actors here are genuinely, unironically hysterical, and it's all way funnier than I remembered as a kid.
No, the flashlight is meant to illuminate.
I will literally rent a camper, and we will drive across America with my flashlight on your chest.
Yeah, and I'll shove it up your ass in the tent. I swear to you all, that's an actual blooper for this movie, I'm not even kidding. Smithsonian also wins me over with its historical details, like all the little fun facts about Amelia Earhart, or how General George Custer feels ashamed of the battle at Bighorn. Even Napoleon isn't portrayed here like a midget or something, as opposed to his portrayals in other media.
But be fat and locked up for tax evasion. Tax evasion? What kind of punk gets pinched for tax evasion?
Composer legend Alan Silvestri returned for this, and he once again knocks it out of the park. The soundtrack has no right being as good as it is. A A lot of it's really grand and majestic and even eerie at times, while some of it really fits the sneaking in mood that the film's going for, and gets you hyped up for this new and far more daring adventure. The action sequences are really well choreographed, the production values and visual effects have also stayed consistently good, with a few exceptions, which is like commendable for a sequel to a kids movie. Something that actually really surprised me on my most recent rewatch is how the script is more carefully put together than I expected it to be, with certain elements established earlier on coming back later in the picture. One good example of that is how, at the beginning, Teddy explains that he didn't tell his friends that they were going without the tablet, as sometimes it's best to give a small lie so as to not deliver the sad, painful truth. And that returns when Larry hesitates to tell Amelia that she's made of wax, and instead, he says that she's made out of wonderful things. Dang, Smithsonian is a lot more thought out than I gave it credit for. Although, as expected, I do have a few nitpicks here and there, like how Akhman-Ra understands English and doesn't rot away into a corpse when he's frozen. Is this implying that he's actually a statue instead of the real pharaoh? Not to mention, Larry and the gang managed to get away with all these crazy shenanigans without getting into trouble? Like, where's all the other Smithsonian night guards during all this? Did the other exhibits just hold them hostage or something? One actual legitimate qualm I have though, and one that's shared by fellow YouTuber Sean Chandler, whatever, is that the pacing can be a little too snappy, and it often gives less time for the emotional moments to really settle in. Regardless, the film's heart is still very clearly in the right place. That sense of childlike wonder and amazement is still very much present, without feeling like it's retreading or going through the motions. We as an audience already know what's going to happen here, and the film does take our insider knowledge into account. Now, the last point I'd like to bring up with this movie is that I kinda believed that it didn't add much of anything to the series' overall story, and was kinda ignored by the third film. This is mostly due to none of the film's newbies appearing again, and the Smithsonian and the events that occurred there never being directly mentioned in conversation. And while that's partially true, in actuality it did still leave a mark, and can't really be passed off as disposable, both with the development of the night program, and with Larry no longer being that interested with inventing, among other details, making the transition between films feel a lot more seamless, making Smithsonian feel like an important piece of the pie. Unlike another particular part 2, with Owen Wilson, a new setting, a supporting cast that doesn't appear again, a group of villains who want to become the most powerful beings in the world, and a sneak-in stealth motif. Wait, what was I talking about again? And that, my friends, is Night at the Museum Battle of the Smithsonian. I was delighted to know that I had so many glowing things to say about this middle chapter, as it's a real dang fun, silly, feel-good excursion with old and new faces. One that I've, ironically enough, learned to appreciate more as I've grown older. I can totally see now why so many people consider this one their favorite of the trilogy. It's cheesy, it's goofy, it's super over the top, and I love every second of it. Heck, for all I know, it may no longer be my least favorite of the bunch anymore. We'll just have to wait and see when I get around to covering the third and final installment, Secret of the Tomb. But until then, go out there and have fun with your lives, and thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.